Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Martin Eichenbaum, who is a professor of economics at Northwestern University and the co-director of the Center for International Economics and Development. His research focuses on macroeconomics, international economics, and monetary theory and policy. He is a fellow of the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a co-editor of the American Economic Review. Welcome, Marty.
Thank you.
I want to start with a paper that is very topical, Bridging the COVID-19 Recession, in which you say policymakers in the COVID-19 era face two critical challenges. First, they must design policies that improve the trade-off between economic activity and health outcomes. And second, they must design policies to improve the long-run damage that a COVID-19-induced recession inflicts on the economy. You want to talk a bit about both the tactical interventions that you see, as well as more strategically what policymakers need to do?
Sure. Let me separate those two challenges. The first challenge is how to deal with this so-called trade-off between health issues and economic issues. So one of the key problems that we initially faced in the panic of COVID, if you like, was this notion that we needed to shut things down to get the health situation under control. Mm-hmm. And that of course is quite reasonable. As an economist, one of the things that became apparent to me was that epidemiology models were incredibly useful, but they don't allow for human beings in the model. What do I mean by that?
Right. Yeah.
There's this two-way interaction between economics and epidemiology that is not recognized in the typical classic epidemiology models. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, the amount of market activity that people engage in, whether consumption, work, etc., obviously depends on people's perceptions of how risky those activities are.
Right.
So nobody wants to go to rock concerts, fly in airlines, etc. That's one interaction that, risk in a health sense translates into economic decisions and overall economic state of the economy. On the other hand, when we engage in less market activity, that affects the risks from health. Mm-hmm. So one thing an economist naturally might ask is, well, are we going to get the right amount of a recession from a social perspective?
Right.
Well, it turns out that using sort of very standard economics, so this is not fancy economics, you quickly come to the conclusion that even though we would have had a recession regardless of what the government did. Mm. But in the short run, that recession wouldn't be large enough how could I reach such a bizarre conclusion? Well, it turns out if you think of an individual person, they take the total amount of infections as given.
Yeah.
I don't think I can affect the total amount of infections in a very large crowd or in the economy as a whole. Just in the same way that when I get in my car, I don't think I'm going to affect the total amount of pollution on the planet.
Right.
But if each and every one of us thinks that way, we get way too much pollution.
Mm.
And what is sort of the standard answer to the pollution problem is, well, you tax activities when people are getting benefits and they don't fully internalize the costs.
Right.
So that's exactly why we think that in the short run, when there's a COVID type of a mass infection, that the government actually needs to have containment measures to make the recession even worse than it would be otherwise. Mm. So that sounds awful, right?
Sort of what you call sort of simple containment, right?
Correct.
Essentially kind of a blanket policy. Yeah.
Right. The brute force reaction was, I don't condition on your age. I don't condition on your health, on various comorbidities. I just say, no one's allowed to go out. Israel's a good example of that. They right now are about to reinstitute a blanket shutdown across the country. So that should come in a week or two. It turns out those things are not politically sustainable.
Right.
It turns out they're optimal if you do the relative. So what do I mean by optimal? You could do nothing, or you could do simple containment. Simple containment does improve the situation in the short run because you're saving a lot of lives. But there's an awful lot of pain that goes with it, and it turns out they're not politically sustainable. So the challenge then is, can we think of more clever ways to achieve dealing with the, quote, pollution problem in ways that are less painful, that lessen the trade-off between short-run economic and health consequences?
Yeah, so Marty, one interesting thing about this issue is that we have a lot of different experiments being run around the world, right? So you can look at New Zealand, you can look at South Korea, Germany to some extent. I don't know exactly what they did. Your point is that if you do a simple blanket containment, it's not sustainable. And when it breaks, you go back to sort of square one. Yep. And that's going to create a huge amount of issue in the latter part of it, right?
Absolutely.
And so successful countries like New Zealand and South Korea, what exactly did they do?
Well, so the lessons are, the countries are really different. I mean, I'm right now writing a paper for the IMF for some conference, and you look at different countries and you look at different cultures and you look at different problems, they're different, right? So I don't think that there's a simple bullet where it's if we were all South Koreans, with all that entails, we would do better.
Right.
We would maintain social distance. We would do tracing. We would listen to the instructions of the health authorities. Those things just vary. And, what's feasible in South Korea may not be feasible here. Relatively homogeneous population, etc. But I think there's some obvious things that we can do in the short run.
Yeah.
For example, the returns to testing, randomized testing, are enormous. We test for two reasons. One is to help the economists and the epidemiologists refine their parameters. That's easy. But more importantly, because lots of infections are asymptomatic, we need to do randomized testing. And when we do that randomized testing, when we find people that are infected, we need to contain them, right? We need to quarantine them. And that may not be entirely voluntary. It can be very humane, but if you have a disease, you're not free to go to the theater. You're not free to go to work. So that's one obvious thing that we can do. Masks ought to be, penalties for not wearing a mask. It's a very, I truly don't understand the politicization of masks. We don't want to talk about politics here, but you need a license to drive a car. You need a license to get married. So we accept the principle of the state imposing some limitations on what we do.
Right.
We accept that you can't scream fire in a crowded theater.
So like your point before, so you need to have, in a diverse country like the US, it seems to me that you have to have some tangible penalties. You need to have a tax on bad behavior like not wearing masks. Otherwise, you're not going to get compliance. And we have 50 different policies going on,
Yep.
as if we have 50 different countries, but we don't have borders around these states. And so even if one state does it really well, 3 weeks later you're back to square one because the adjacent state did nothing.
Well, that's right. I mean, there's a tension here, right? We have to accept the constraints of the Constitution, and different states have different rights, and Washington, for good or for bad, can't tell everybody what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just, that's different in Israel. That's different in South Korea. I'm not, so different countries will have different political and legal constraints. That's where leadership comes in. We don't want to get political. Washington has levers with which it can lead, but it cannot lead by fiat. So
Right.
That's just a constraint that we have to accept. And, you do see one of the advantages of the federal system. We have natural experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
So we can learn from each other. So when a country like Russia gets it right, it gets it really right. And when it gets it wrong, it gets it really wrong.
Right.
We have a more hedged society, but if politicians and people can honestly learn from the experiments, they're not quite random, but learn from the experiments of other states. And Illinois, I think, has done a pretty good job where I live. Not perfect, but I think it's done a pretty good job. And there are lessons that other states can learn from us and that we can learn from them. But on issues like masks, that's a pretty small tax to impose on individuals.
Right.
For the social good. So.
And so from an intervention perspective, you did some sort of econometric models around this, right? So
Right.
You could have choice one, no action, choice two, some sort of simple containment,
Right.
and choice three, more, thoughtful intervention. And these three policy issues have different effects if you look around 6 months, 1 year time frame, right?
Correct. Yeah, and it's very clear that the worst outcome is doing nothing.
Yeah.
The second to worst outcome are these sort of brute force simple containment measures, but you get dramatic gains in terms of deaths and the size of the recession if you go to what we call smart containment. And you can see how that works, that if people are confident that when they go to work, that there aren't a lot of other infected people, we will have a much healthier economy because people will be more willing to go to work, more willing to consume, etc. So smart containment is a win-win.
Right.
So you just improve the trade-offs on the different dimensions.
Yeah. So can you put some numbers on it, Marty? So what's sort of the GDP fallout? If we were to run these three experiments from start, what would you expect to see?
Well, it's interesting you asked that. When we first did these numbers, we were quite shocked at what we were getting. And your audience is sophisticated enough to know that models are just that. They're models. They have to be taken with a grain of salt. But in our very first paper, the numbers turned out to be not bad at all. So in terms of GDP, where the initial model said that if you did nothing, you would land up, I think we said basically having at an annualized rate a 25% drop roughly in GDP. That's right. I'm looking at the pictures now, but 25 to 30% drop in annualized GDP, and that's pretty much what we might have seen.
Yeah.
And just an enormous numbers of deaths. If you went to simple containment, you had a larger recession initially, but many fewer deaths. If you go to smart containment, the trade-offs were really quite dramatically different. You went to a recession that was about a third as large.
Yeah.
Well, in the most extreme case, if you really, and we don't have the science or the infrastructure to do this, if you could really do massive randomized testing on a very frequency basis, you would basically eliminate COVID very quickly and the economic implications very, very quickly. To a first order, you would have very few deaths and very small drop in GDP. That's more aspirational because, as we all know, literally the act of getting up the ability to do randomized testing on that kind of a basis is just not something we're capable of doing right now. Although you could argue that had we started in February, we would be in such a position to do that now.
Yeah, and so, politicians sometimes argue that it's one or the other. Either you get good economics or you take care of people in this case.
I fundamentally disagree. Yeah. So that a central message of all of this research is that is a false choice.
Right.
To the extent that people are more confident about their objective health when they engage in market activity, we will have more of it. And by the way, we have amazing data now. I'm working on a project with various people from Portugal where we can track literally at the individual level. We can control for age, income. In the simplest terms, take, for example, public servants in Portugal, of whom there are many. They're not worried about losing their job. So one question we asked was, how do these people act as a function of age and comorbidity in terms of their consumption expenditures? So if I look at a 60, the probability of death from COVID is very nonlinear in age. So the medicine is very sharp in terms of who should be really afraid. Using this sort of super micro level, that's exactly what we see at the individual level, that this nonlinear drop in consumption as people get older or comorbidity. So people are responding to the economic incentives in these models, and those incentives tell you, get the health situation under control, the economy will very quickly also get under control. There really is no persistent, robust recovery in the economy until we get the health situation under control.
Yeah, and one thing we haven't really looked at is sort of the long-term effects of COVID-19. So, people have been talking about herd immunity. Sweden has a policy that was really trying to get to herd immunity. But, this thing mutates, it evolves, it has different strains. There is data on reinfection. We don't know about the long-term effects. About 1 million people who recovered from 1819 Spanish flu, 10 years later got Parkinson's disease. So if you look at disease burden of COVID-19, we haven't even begun to aggregate the total burden of the disease. So any policy that basically says, hey, let's get 60% of the population infected and we are done, seems like a really bad policy.
I think it's not something I'm personally ethically. I mean, I know I'm here not as a rabbi or as a priest, but it seems like giving up and just letting a bunch of people die, surely we can do better than that. Especially when we don't know, as you say, what the real cost of that is in the long run. And it seems to me there are obvious things that we can do that really don't impact too much on people's individual freedom that can make a big difference, like masks. Testing. Larry Summers. If you think about the cost to society, I think Larry Summers, ex-Secretary of Treasury, did some calculation of what it cost the U.S. economy per day this recession, and the numbers are just absolutely astounding. I can tell you what they are. I'm just looking them up right now. I think Larry's was something like $80 million, $80 billion a week. $80 billion a week. Right. So because it's a big economy, right? $20 trillion roughly.
Right.
If you have so it's just a massive number. And even if Larry's off by half, right? Let's suppose he's off by half and it's 40 billion.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, what are these social returns to testing, of investing in testing facilities?
Right.
Well, to the extent that we can make this recession shorter by ending the health crisis, this is a terrific investment. And I would take it in a second.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting that you listen to politicians, you listen to policymakers. You don't really hear, Marty, I don't spend a lot of time. You don't really hear systematic analyses, right? That says, if I do this, this is a total economic impact on the system type arguments. It seems really ad hoc. It's a group of people sitting around trying to do something.
It's complicated. I mean, I think so. I have some experience with policymakers, and there's an enormous heterogeneity across them, but they're like firefighters.
Right.
I mean, to be totally honest, they're firefighters. And it's easy for academics like me to sit on the side. Well, if I was in charge, I would do thoughtful. These guys are, they're running. Their building's burning down. They got to do something. They got 50,000 constituents, all of whom want different things. And as I say, the models are really, I was quite shocked when I went back to March, and my co-authors and I were looking at these models. As I say, the scientists know a lot about the science.
Yeah.
It turns out each infection is different, but they know a lot. What they don't know a lot about is how that interacts with social science.
Right.
And so I can't honestly go to, a politician and say, look, it's March. Here's what I absolutely know with enormous confidence. What it really has to be is more the nature of a thoughtful conversation, of probabilities, of uncertainties, of worst case outcomes, and they don't have time for it.
Right. And it becomes very complex. So other thing that I thought of, Marty, I don't know if this is relevant. The policy choices is also a function of initial conditions that you're dealing with. For example, the tri-state area where I live, there is enough evidence now the disease was rampant in November, December timeframe. The first intervention was more like in March.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you already have 30% of the population infected, for example, I came from New York early January with 103-degree fever that lasted for three days and it went away. I don't know if it was COVID or something else, but indications are, 25, 30% of the population might already have been infected by the time we recognized it and started interventions. Those initial conditions would matter, right? What we do.
Oh, no doubt about it. And their initial conditions can be very subtle as well. In terms, I'll give you an example, comorbidities.
Yeah.
Right. So we know African American population is suffering disproportionately, Hispanic population as well, in terms of health outcomes, also in terms of economic outcomes for other reasons, but just health outcomes. And part of that is the legacy of poverty, comorbidity, lifestyle choices, in terms of nutrition, etc. Some of which is voluntary, some of which is forced on individuals because of objective circumstances, but those are initial conditions.
Right.
So in Chicago, if you look at who is dying, it's wildly disproportionate. If you go to the South Side, where there are lots of comorbidities and poverty, etc., medical facilities, wildly different on the South Side than the North Side. It's a fact that on the North Side, where I live, thank God, we can afford it, there's an excess of medical capacity during this crisis. That is obviously not true on the South Side. That's a kind of an social initial condition.
Right. And so interventions need to be customized, almost community by community.
Some of them do, absolutely. Yeah. And some of them we have to make hard choices like, are you willing to take away some medical capacity from the rich North Shore to redistribute it on a real-time basis to the South Shore? What is the right ethical, economic, and health framework to think about such a difficult choice?
Yeah, so I want to jump into a broader paper in the area of monetary policy, which, your expertise, and you've done a lot of work in this area, entitled Rethinking Fiscal Policy in an Era of Low Interest Rates, in which you say secular stagnation and low real interest rates compel us to rethink the extent to which fiscal policy should be used to combat recessions. And the paper argues that we should adopt a system of asymmetric automatic stabilizers. Before we get into it, Marty, I have a confession to make. In my note to you, I mentioned I went to school at Northwestern. What I did not mention was that I went to graduate engineering there. And when I was getting ready to go to business school, I applied there, but they wouldn't take me back. So I had to go a few kilometers south to Hyde Park. But more importantly, after the MBA, where I went to work for corporations,
Mm-hmm.
I would say it took less than a week to recognize that most of what we learn in the MBA school in finance did not actually work in real companies, right? And discounted cash flow analysis, net present value, CAPM, and all that stuff. And most people forget economics a few months after graduation. And so many of my listeners might be in the same spot. So you have to ease us into this a bit.
Sure.
Uh, but automatic stabilizers, from what I remember, I always liked, sort of things that kick in without people doing something. So
Right.
perhaps a passive monetary policy and the stabilizers that you talk about are preferable in my view as humans, let alone politicians and policymakers, are never good decision makers in the presence of uncertainty, right?
Well, sure. I mean, let me take each of those in parts. A lot of aspects to that. The first part is what are automatic stabilizers?
Yeah.
Well, those are, think about unemployment benefits. Maybe the best way to do it is to be very concrete. When the economy goes into a recession, two things happen automatically by law that we don't think about. Unemployment benefits, people get them. Often we supplement them by additional laws, but even if we didn't, they're automatic stabilizers, right? You get fired, a lot of people, they get benefits from the government. That stabilizes demand. The fact that you're getting a check from the government means that you wouldn't cut back on your consumption expenditures as much as you would otherwise.
Yeah.
And if many people are doing that, that helps demand and therefore the economy. It also means you don't save as much every time you're worried, and that can help the economy as well, right? If we all are afraid of a crisis and we all start not spending, that can be a self-fulfilling problem. So that's one aspect. The other aspect that people don't always realize is tax rates are progressive, right?
Yep.
So if you make $100,000, your marginal tax rate's higher than if you make $50,000.
Right.
So when the economy goes into a recession, tax rates fall because people fall into lower brackets, or many do. And that too puts more money in their pocket and helps stabilize demand. So those are two examples of automatic stabilizers. They're supplemented in practice by a willy-nilly political process of where, when there's a really big crisis, we extend unemployment benefits, right? We did that under Obama. We did it until right now. The HEROES Act gave out lots of payments to individuals who are unemployed, extended their unemployment benefits. But as we see, that doesn't always work because Congress is at a standstill now when we may stop doing that.
Right.
This is your point about real-time decision-making.
Yeah.
So that's what an automatic stabilizer is. Well, how does that tie up with the first things that you said? Well, up until recently, let's say 10 years ago, up until the financial crisis of 2008, everybody kind of agreed. When I say everybody, I mean there was a lot of consensus that let's leave that to the Fed. When there's a crisis or recession, the Fed has a wonderful set of tools by which it can essentially boost demand or lower demand as necessary. How do they do that? Well, they can lower interest rates. That's the traditional policy. And when they lower interest rates, why does that work? Well, it makes it cheaper for companies to borrow. It makes it cheaper or more attractive for people to go on vacation, to buy cars, big ticket items, which they would typically borrow to do. Refinance, right? If you lower interest rates, a lot of people refinance homes. They have extra money in their pocket and they can go spend it. So that's the traditional dial that the Fed was using. We get in trouble, we lower rates, the economy starts to perk up, inflation starts to heat up, and then they raise rates to cool the economy down.
So quick question there, Marty. So the conventional monetary policy, they are really trying to reduce short-term rates, right?
Yes, but they do it in a very, but okay, so great question. How does that translate into long-term rates?
Yeah.
I just bought this MBAs. You can think of an individual who, if I tell you that short rates are going to be persistently low, that has an effect through financial markets on long-term rates. Why?
Okay.
So suppose I tell you that you can take out 1 5-year loan or sequentially 5 1-year loans.
Mm-hmm.
There needs to be a relationship between those two.
Right.
So if the Fed tells you we are going to keep 1-year interest rates low for the next 5 years,
mm-hmm.
that puts downward pressure on the current 5-year interest rate. Mm-hmm. Right? Just because people could, if the 5-year interest rate was too low, they would say, no, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to roll over 1-year interest rate loans.
Right. Is there, if the market really believes Fed is doing the right thing and economy is going to come back on, wouldn't they expect interest rates to go up in the future?
Well, so it's a balance. It's a balance, and we can look at any point in time when the Fed acts, what are futures markets telling us about, well, we can first see right now when the Fed lowers the interest rate today, what does that do to the yield curve? So what does it do to 1-year rate, 2-year rates, 3 years, 4-year rates? And you are correct that long-term rates are less sensitive to Fed manipulation than short-term interest rates. But they are sensitive. That is to say, there are things that the Fed can do in various econometric studies which sort of are consistent with the view that, the Fed can lower mortgage rates when it lowers short-term interest rates through the mechanisms that I talked about.
Right.
So it's pretty convincing on that dimension.
Okay. So generally, people agree that monetary policy, it's quick to effect. Fiscal policy intervention is going to take time. And the effects of that is sort of ambiguous for a variety of reasons. So monetary policy is the way to go when you get into trouble. But then you have a situation when you cannot really move interest rates too much beyond zero, right? Is that the issue?
Right. I mean, that's a very important point that what's happened over time for a lot of reasons is for reasons not under the control of the Fed, real interest rates and nominal interest rates have been declining. One way to think about what do you expect the average interest rate to be over time? Well, you can think about the Fed has an inflation target, which is about 2%. And then you can say, well, what's the real interest rate over long periods of time, sort of inflation corrected, that is determined in the market? Maybe the real rate of return on capital is 2%. Add up 2 plus 2, you get about 4%, which is where interest rates used to be. And what's happened over time, for reasons we don't entirely understand, it's partly demographic, partly other things, the real interest rate has been declining. And we have very good measures of that. And one of the wonderful things the Fed does is there's something called FRED, which is the Federal Reserve database that you can get from St. Louis. You just Google put in real interest rate FRED, and you can graph it and see exactly what I mean. That real interest rates come down, and then not surprisingly, nominal interest rates have come down.
Right.
So usually when a recession starts, the Fed lowers nominal interest rates. That's what they control. But if you're starting in a situation where interest rates are basically now zero, it's pretty tough to go negative. You can, to some extent, but you can't really push rates too negative, or people start abandoning the financial system. There are all sorts of bad things like that. So the Fed can't do its normal playbook. Next thing is Bernanke, real time, said, well, okay, I can't do the normal thing. I'm going to start doing other stuff to directly work on long-term interest rates, which weren't at zero. But what could he do? Well, he could buy and sell different assets.
That's quantitative easing?
Yeah, exactly. Quantitative easing. They could buy mortgages. They could buy longer-term treasury bills. Now, for example, the Fed is actually buying various sorts of corporate debt. And by directly intervening in those markets, they clearly have an effect on the yields or interest rates on those assets. But if you look at the yield curve now, we're starting off with a situation where long-term interest rates are very low. So if you just go to my friend Fred and ask 10-year interest rates, you'll see that those are very, very low.
Mm.
Any of your listeners are trying to put money in a bond fund will know that.
Right.
So if you're starting at a 10-year rate that's around 1% or lower,
Mm.
there's not much the Fed can do there either.
Right.
So I believe that the Fed is sort of very important for panics and financial markets and will continue to be so. Sort of normal firefighting of recessions, there's just not much that they have at their disposal now. They'll do the best that they can, but they're simply not in a position, I don't think, to have dramatic effects. And so you're left with our less favored alternative, fiscal policy.
Right.
You
Just
mentioned
just a quick
Yeah.
question, Marty. So, is there a conditioning effect here? For example, if market sort of anticipates what the Fed is going to do, whether it's short-term interest rate, conventional policy, or quantitative easing for long-term interest rate, when trouble starts, markets will gravitate there fairly quickly, right?
Absolutely. No, the markets, that's one of the reasons the Fed has worked very hard in the last, let me say, 15 years, has been, so when Alan Greenspan was the chairman of the Fed,
Yeah.
We used to talk about, he was a very mysterious, very opaque communication. No one ever knew very clearly in advance what he was going to do.
He used to come out with that black handbag, I remember.
Exactly. And there's been a real sea change. Bernanke, reflecting his academic training and temper, the Fed moved very much to a situation of saying, look, we really want to be as obvious as we can. We want you to know exactly what we're going to do.
Mm.
There's a lot of research trying to write down sort of so-called Taylor rules, named after John Taylor, with this beautiful equation describing to a first and second order what the Fed would do as a function of the state of the economy.
Mm.
And it turns out it's pretty, not that mysterious.
Right.
Given the inflation target, given their estimates of unemployment rates, the Taylor rule basically tells you what would the Fed do. And to give you a great example, the Atlanta Fed has on their facility, which anybody can play with. I often do it with MBAs. You put in different assumptions for the inflation target, et cetera. You can see what the Fed says we would do this is the Atlanta Fed, not Washington, but it's a good indication of what they would do. So they've worked very, very hard to tell you what they're doing. Forward guidance, which some of your listeners may know of, is basically a fancy way of saying we are, when the Fed says we're going to keep interest rates really low for a really long time.
Yeah.
They're basically helping the market say, oh, the Fed's going to keep interest rates low for a long time. That should lower long interest rates in a way we talked about before, and that should help the economy now.
Right.
So the Fed has really worked very hard to be painfully obvious. So surprise is not something the Fed wants.
So it has a downside. So in situations like we are in today, there isn't a lot they could do.
Nope.
You are, close to that zero mark. And so your argument is that, the issues that we typically think about, fiscal stimulus, that takes time, that's very political, and so on. But what if we have a policy that is sort of automatic, right, when you hit this type of an issue?
Right. So what I argued was that, so let's think about 2008, when we hit this really big recession. After a lot of debate and yelling and screaming, we increased the size of unemployment benefits. In a very ad hoc way. It was better than doing nothing. But what I was arguing was that we could have a system in which the Fed, we wrote a law that said when certain macro targets hit their, say unemployment exceeds a certain number or the interest rates hit zero, then unemployment benefits go up, right? So if they're normally, the replacement ratio is, let's say 50%, we would make it 80%.
Right.
Or if normally they would last for 12 months, for 12 weeks, we can make them last 32 weeks.
Yeah.
When we hit those macro targets, and critically, when we got away. So unemployment hit another number, namely a better number,
Mm.
the system would revert to normal.
Right.
So this was my way, but not just me, other people as well, of saying, look, we can have the benefits of short-term predictable stimulus
Mm.
without locking in entitlements that are very hard to take away,
Right.
so that they would be responsible fiscally. And there are many, many examples of those kinds of expenditures that we could put in. A great example that Marty Feldstein talked about in the context of Japan 30 years ago
Mm.
was, he said they have a national sales tax. And he said, why not get rid of the national sales tax under certain circumstances, or lower it,
Mm.
and then reinstate it?
Right. Right.
So that, there's sales taxes, there's aid. Look, right now we're talking about aid to local governments. And, if we don't, right now, because of the COVID crisis, states and cities are facing roughly $1 trillion deficit.
Right.
And unlike the federal government, they can't borrow.
They have to balance the budget. Yeah.
So they have to cut expenditures right now.
Mm.
And you have to ask yourself, do you think that's a good idea to cut government expenditures by roughly $1 trillion when unemployment is currently 8.5%?
Right.
That doesn't seem like a real good idea.
Yeah.
Well, if we had had a law that said if unemployment exceeds 8%, or if national sales tax, or if cities are in certain, you have to write this carefully, because you don't want the city of Chicago to do silly things knowing they'll be bailed out. So it's not a trivial thing to write.
But it's not that manipulatable, right, Marty? I mean, because the metrics are more macroeconomic metrics. You cannot really manipulate them.
I agree. I agree with that.
Yeah.
But one has to be very careful to do it in a way that doesn't input perverse incentives.
Yeah.
But I think it's doable.
Yeah.
And while there are risks to anything, the risks right now of massive cuts in government expenditures, both in terms of health and in terms of the economy, to me, are outweighed or outweigh any sort of long-term alternative consideration. So, but rather than doing it in a panic, these arguments that I was making would say, let's do this when times are good.
Mm.
We can have thoughtful discourse. We can do this in the right way, rather than in the heat of the moment, where we're unlikely to get it right.
Right. I want to touch on this phenomenon of real interest rates coming down all over the world, right? So there is something going on.
Yep.
And so what do we know about that?
Well, so we know some hard facts.
Yeah.
Right. That are just, kind of, those are true things, which is that real interest rates, just for readers or listeners who don't know, there's two kinds of interest rates. There's nominal interest rates. That's what you get when you put your money in a bond, typically, right?
Yeah.
If inflation goes up, you'll get less. If inflation goes, it'll be worth less. So real interest rates are that nominal interest rate minus inflation over the period that you've held the asset.
Mm-hmm.
So if I get a 5% nominal interest rate, but inflation was 3%, I'm really only getting 2%. That's the real interest rate.
Right.
Okay, well, we have lots of good measures of real interest rates, including something called TIPS, which are Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, which are literally a promise by the government to give you a real interest rate. So I can just look it up. And but it's not just the US, it's the UK. There are many, many countries that have these sorts of things. What have those objects been doing? Well, they've been going down secularly. So we just know the real interest rate has been going down. There are many theories about why. Part of it is an aging world that wants to save more. That, so you have more savings, looking for safe yields. That's going to drive down interest rates. So that's one set of explanations, demographic. The other, people like Larry Summers have talked about the kinds of investments that we make now in an age of technology are less capital intensive. Mm-hmm. So think about Google, the amount of capital that they need compared to US Steel.
Yeah.
Pretty trivial.
Right.
They need other kinds of things, but they don't need, those big capital intensive investments. So, partly technology, partly demographics, partly, and this will shock your readers, There's not as much technological progress now
Mm.
as there was 30 years ago.
Mm.
Every undergraduate always thinks that, we live in a brand new world where nobody ever thought of anything new except for this generation.
But we
People
have
have bought,
artificial intelligence, Marty.
well, that might work. We can look at productivity, the growth rate of productivity,
Yeah.
and it's slowing down.
Right.
This always shocks people. I know when I talk to industry executives, they can always think of an example.
Yeah.
But as best as we can measure it, and it's not so easy to measure, the growth rate of productivity is slowing down.
Right.
That's a big mystery. I want to recommend a book by my colleague Robert Gordon, who has written extensively on this issue and is one of the great experts, and has documented this fact. And it is really quite an astounding phenomenon. Let me give you one example from an industry I know a lot about, which is banking.
Yeah.
Every time we get rid of a bank teller, which God knows we do, we have to hire somebody for cybersecurity.
Right.
Right. So if you now it is true the number of people in banking is going down over time, but it's a lot less dramatic than you would think.
It's just shifting specializations, so to speak.
Yeah. It's we don't entirely understand why the growth rate of productivity is coming down, but it is.
And then, the really measurable attribute there too, which is sort of the aggregate population. And so most developed countries, I think, has less than 2.1, which is supposed to be replacement rate already.
Correct.
And if we continue on that track, I think developed countries as a whole hits a negative mark around 2040 or something like that, right?
Yeah, well, Japan is the most dramatic example of that, where it's actually going to be a much less populated place than it is now. Europe is quite similar. The U.S. is moving in that direction less dramatically, partly because traditionally we've had higher immigration levels. And so just what do we know about demographics? It turns out, once you get past starvation levels, that as people get richer, they have less kids.
Right.
It's just a universal fact. And as countries have gone, and the economics of that are pretty simple. If you're, rich, if you're working, if your wife is working, the opportunity cost of having a child goes through the roof, right? So when I teach MBAs and there's, roughly 50% of the people in the class are women, I go, the cost to you guys of having a kid is taking a year off, and thank God you're very educated. That's a very expensive thing.
Right.
So you respond by having less of it. We can go on and on about, it's a fascinating topic about how people substitute the market for their own time with kids, right? So it's not a coincidence that people, kids have all sorts of market inputs to their education, tennis lessons, chess lessons, violin lessons, tutors. That's all in view of mom and dad, who are very, very busy doing other things. Anyway, so, but it's a worldwide phenomenon. And yeah, it's absolutely right.
So in a world that population declines, and I don't know the exact numbers, but they say that the maximum is going to be around 9.5 billion. I'm talking about the entire world now. And then when we hit 9.5 billion, which is not too far into the future, it will start to decline. And I don't think we ever been in a declining population world, right?
Not well. I mean, leaving aside,
not sudden,
right.
Not due to sudden shocks. Yeah.
Well, part of that is great news, right? I mean, you kind of think about it, and we often talk about inequality, which is, of course, horrible.
Yeah.
But if you ask yourself, what's the headline of the last 60 years? It's that inequality across countries has gone down. Why do I say that? Well, just think China, India.
Yeah.
Right? They have now entered eras of relative prosperity. And that's terrific news. And their population growth rate, less so in India in terms of population growth rate, but even in India, things are slowing down a bit. The fact that the population growth rate is declining is a symptom of all the good news on the economic front.
Mhm.
So I'm thrilled about that. In terms of the environment, that's terrific stuff, right? So
Sure.
there's lots of good news or reflects good news, but it obviously poses important challenges. An aging population is very different than a young population.
Right.
And we're struggling with understanding all the consequences of that.
Right. So the average age of the population will continue to go up
Yeah, I
for
think
a long
that's
period of
certainly
time.
true. There are enormous fiscal challenges, healthcare expenditure challenges in the United States that go with that. You know, our government, if you look at the budget, it is increasingly, we are taking money that used to be spent on young people and spending it on old people, on healthcare, social security, etc. That's real challenges. Are we getting that right? I mean, right. So, you know, old people used to be very poor in this country. If you go back to the 60s, the 50s, they are now quite rich.
Yeah.
Young people in many parts of this country don't have enough to eat, not enough education. Something doesn't seem quite right with the way we've allocated those resources.
The young people might want their own country at some point. That's a risk.
Well, I mean, you know, frankly, if you read blogs, you see a lot of tension. You know, people,
Yeah.
I'm a boomer, right? I don't know how old you are,
Yeah.
but I'm a boomer. And I think young people are pretty upset about it, and maybe they're right.
Right. Yeah. It's yeah. You know, you just have there's so many things it's going to affect. Just the population growth. For me, the productivity, you know, sort of stabilization. Um, Maybe we'll get another technology shock. Who knows? That will take care of that in the future. But population, I think, is that there's nothing much one could do about that trend.
Well, I don't think we
And
want to. I don't look. We
yeah,
can't. Well, I mean, to be clear, one thing we can do in the United States is allowing for more immigration.
yeah,
That's easy, right? There's lots of very talented Indians and people in the Middle East and Chinese people who are young would love to come here. This is a very not densely populated country. That's a political choice, right? I'm not saying we should do it, but it's certainly we could do it, and it would keep the population younger.
yeah. We had sort of a monopoly on it for a long time. Not anymore.
That's
And I
true.
think countries like Canada have really gotten onto that. I think.
Well, so I'm a Canadian, or I'm
Yeah.
both actually, and it is a conscious decision of the Canadian government to take advantage of other countries' decisions to be more closed. You know, so and they have a very rational immigration system, which is a point-based system, which says if you're educated, if you're young, we want you. Real simple.
Right. Right. Yeah, so I want to touch on one more paper, Marty. And so this is related topic, state-dependent effects of monetary policy, the refinancing channel. So when interest rates go down, people with higher interest mortgages, the hope is that they will refinance it, and that puts some additional money in their pocket. But what you're saying in the paper is that it depends very much on the state of the system at that point, right?
Right. So let me give you an extreme example.
Yeah.
Suppose that we were in a very stable environment, and everybody had, you know, bought their normal mortgages, etc. Let's say those mortgages were 4%, and then the Fed reduced interest rates. Well, there would be a huge number of people that if they refinanced at 4%, if the Fed lowered interest rates, could really make a lot of savings by refinancing, right?
Right.
Well, had 4%, now you could do 3%. There's a whole bunch of us that could do that. So you would expect to get a big kick in terms of the economy if the Fed cut interest rates after a long period of stability, say at 4%.
Yeah.
But now imagine that the Fed was lowering interest rates for a while, like they've been doing now. You wouldn't necessarily get a huge, well, let me be careful. this is even simpler. Suppose that the Fed was raising rates. Okay, so we start at 4%, and then the Fed was raising rates 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%. If at 7%, the Fed cut interest rates.
Big effect.
Well, you got to be careful. All the people who refinanced at 4%, 5%, and 6%.
Oh, right.
If I cut interest rates from 7, I'm not. Those people are going to go fine, but I'm not going to refinance.
Yeah, they're already locked into. These are fixed mortgages.
Yeah, these are even if they paid the cost.
Yeah.
Going from 7 to 6, you're not going to get the people at 5 and 4. They're not going to benefit from a mortgage rate that's 6.5 now. So you can see that it now becomes much trickier to think about what the Fed should or shouldn't do at various points in time. How many people you're able to effectively get to refinance depends on not the level of interest rate, but the whole path of interest rates, the pool of potential savings.
Right.
So what this paper does is sort of work out when is monetary policy going to be most powerful and when is it going to be less powerful, and what lessons we can learn from that about current monetary policy.
Yeah. And so how much of the refinancing effect, just approximately, Marty, how much does it affect the economy, the refinancing aspect?
It's a big effect because remember, mortgage markets are a big deal.
Yeah.
And it's so one channel that, people, the obvious channel, well, I have more money in my pocket, so that's pretty obvious. But the other channel that people typically don't think about is many people are house rich, but liquidity constrained. Right. So, for example, you can imagine that people have a bunch of home equity, but they'd like to do repairs on the house. They'd like to buy a car. They'd like to go on vacation, but they can't borrow. They can't go into a bank. The bank's going to say, we've looked at the numbers. We're not willing to make that loan.
So they could do what you call a cash out mortgage too, right?
Precisely. They can refinance if it's an attractive time to do it, take some of the equity out of their house, free them up to do consumption expenditures of other sorts. And that's a big deal. Now, but the other thing is what you find often also is entrepreneurs can do this to start businesses, small businesses. We're not talking about GM now. But all of these cash out refinancing can have a very big effect on consumption and a very big effect actually on small business formation.
Right. So this happens more readily when you have sort of the same direction of interest rates. So if interest rates have been going down for a long time, as you lower it, you will get effect. But if you're kind of zigzagging, the effect may not be that high.
Well, the zigzagging, I would say that the most extreme cases imagine that interest rates were constant for a long time.
Yeah.
And if so everybody has a 4% interest rate.
Right.
If the Fed lowers things to 3%, every single person in the economy has a mortgage would benefit from refinancing.
Okay.
So that's going to be a very powerful effect.
So it's really the stock of mortgages. So they really have to study the variations in fixed rates that exist in the stock of mortgages in the economy. That can be computable, I would imagine.
Well, so in this paper, we compute the various measures of the gains to refinancing at every point in time in, say, the last 40 years. So one thing you can do, this is the simplest thing that you can do, is just literally look, like I can go in right now and have the data to look at every mortgage on the books. I can get that data. And then I can say, if that person refinanced, what could they refinance at? So now I have the difference in the interest rate they are paying, the interest rate that they would pay if they refinanced. And I can get the whole distribution at every point in time of what that interest rate gap looks like.
And that delta has to be more than the cost of refinancing too, right?
Yes. So, fixed costs are crucial. It's because otherwise the gap would always be zero, right? If it was costless to refinance, you would always refinance.
Yeah.
But you can't, both because of pecuniary fixed costs, but also the time, the effort, all the, we're all lazy a little bit, and we're busy.
Yeah.
But what you do see are enormous variation over time in that distribution.
Right. Right. So in conclusion, Marty, so given the situation that we are in, huge GDP loss, monetary policies sort of hit the bottom, both ends of the yield curve. We don't have automatic stabilizers in place. We have, looks like, sort of a conflict-based standstill in Washington regarding additional stimulus. What would you do in the next 6 months? 6 months to 1
If I
year.
had a compelling answer to that, you'd either give me a Nobel Prize or make me president. So I don't think I have a compelling answer. A couple things. Principles. First is good health policy is good economic policy now. Anything that we can do to get COVID under control will be a net win for the economy.
Yeah.
So that's important. The other thing I would emphasize to listeners is interest rates are at incredible low, which means it's incredibly reasonable. So ask yourself as a business person, if you can borrow at 1%, what investments are worth borrowing to engage in?
Right.
Because interest rates are such a low number now, for the United States government, the hurdle rate for social investments and stimulus should be very low. You're basically borrowing for free.
But we don't invest it properly, typically, right? We don't have a portfolio prioritization process in the government.
Well, so that is, so A, you're right. I totally agree with that. But B, it does say that there are enormous potential gains from thinking thoughtfully about what we could do.
Right. And the point is, both the government and the private individuals is in a situation that money is almost free.
Yep.
So if they can find right investments, and that's where the trick is going to be, if you can find the right investments, then the returns are enormous.
I agree. And let me give you two examples of where we could probably agree pretty quickly. Testing. I know testing is expensive.
Yeah.
The returns to testing are incredibly high socially. Right? Only because people will go to work if we test and act on that. So if the government has to borrow $1 billion to do randomized testing, almost surely that's a great investment.
Or just give it to states to do it.
Yeah, I don't care if, there's a czar in Washington who's actually running it, but testing, whether Pritzker's doing it or Cuomo's doing it or, Gavin Newsom, it's a great investment.
Yes.
That's an easy one. You get into more difficult, longer term things. Look, I mean, this recession is very unusual in that women have been hurt very badly by it. Usually men suffer more in recessions because they're in industries that are more cyclical.
Yeah.
This recession is very different, right? Because women tend to be in high contact, physical contact industries, nursing, services, etc. But so they're hurt on that dimension in terms of unemployment, but they're the primary, often for social and cultural reasons that I'm no expert on, they're in charge of the kids. They can't get back to work unless there's help for them with teachers, with daycare, all those things. But think of that as an economist. The rate of return to investing in helping women is a huge positive number if they can get back to work.
Right. Yeah, I mean, these are, sort of socio-economic policies. Do we have policy makers? I mean, we have people who are focused on economics and finance and, general nuts and bolts of the economy. But do we have policymakers who take all this, different avenues of data and make optimum decisions? Do we really have a structure for that?
No.
And that's the problem.
I wish I could say, look, I'll give you an example of the kinds of things some other countries have done. So in France, Macron has just appointed a incredibly interesting commission of leading thinkers, actually led by Jean Tirole, who is Nobel laureate. and Olivier Blanchard, who very distinguished economist, chief economist for the IMF after a long career at MIT, of getting together the best and the brightest to think about France over the next 20 years and start that conversation. No one can commit to agreeing to what they say, but they will put interesting things on the table.
Right.
Canada has various avenues for ranking or calculating as best as we can, it's not perfect, the rate of return to different investments. That is something we could do.
I mean, we have the expertise, we just don't have the will to do it.
We have a very complicated, chaotic federal system in which lots of people do lots of different things.
Yeah.
And, the one thing I would say in defense of the United States, this is a very heterogeneous society. It is not Sweden. It is not Finland, where everybody looks the same, has similar backgrounds, where we automatically sympathize with each other because we look the same way.
Right. Yeah.
And that's actually an important social science point.
Yeah.
So we have challenges because of our heterogeneity, but that heterogeneity can also be a source of strength because we can bring different perspectives and opinions to the table.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Marty. Thanks so much for spending
My pleasure.
time with me.
My pleasure. I hope you and your family are safe and sound and we all get through this together.
Same to you. Yeah, keep the kids away from each other.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.